If anyone's already joined us, welcome to our webinar on paying for college during a pandemic. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes, so we'll wait for registrants to enter, and we'll start just 5 minutes or so. Welcome again, everyone. If you've just joined, we're going to be starting our webinar, Paying for College During a Pandemic, in about 2 minutes. Thanks for being here. All right, let's get started. Welcome everyone to today's webinar on paying for college during a pandemic, hosted by Forbes Advisor and savingforcollege.com. I'm Brianna McGurran, the student loans analyst at Forbes Advisor, which provides trusted advice to help consumers make financial decisions with confidence. Joining me today is an incredible panel with some names you likely recognize, and I'm so excited to introduce them all to you and to learn from them today about this really important topic. We have Jean Chatzky, CEO of HerMoney.com and financial editor at The Today Show. We have Mark Kantrowitz, publisher and VP of research at SavingForCollege.com. And Michelle Singletary, personal finance columnist for The Washington Post. Thank you all so much for being here today.
Good to be here.
Absolutely.
Excellent. So before we start, I'd love to remind our viewers that this is a live event. So if you have questions, please add them to the comment section on this Facebook Live event, and we'll do our best to answer them either during this conversation or afterwards on Facebook. And several registrants have already submitted questions in advance, which is awesome. So we'll get to some of those throughout the conversation. Now let's chat about paying for college during this very complicated time for everyone. Michelle, I'd love to start with you. The first question is, every day colleges are releasing their plans for the fall, and increasingly schools are going all remote, even after initially saying they'd host in-person classes. So what are colleges currently doing, or not doing in some cases, to bring their costs in line with instructional changes for the fall?
Well, I have actually two children who are in college. One is a rising senior and one is a rising junior. So my experience with it is real right now with both schools. So all during the summer since July, the plans have been constantly changing. Any parent right now knows it's just maddening. Will they be able to stay on campus? Will they have in-class classes? In-person classes, and then there was sort of a hybrid, and now we just got, my kids go to state schools in Maryland, literally just got a note yesterday that says they all have to be tested 10 days before they show up on campus. So my daughter, who's the rising junior, she's good on her campus at Towson University. They have, you can take all your classes online, and many professors have some students in the classroom and some online, and the students can choose which one they're more comfortable with. She's chosen to do some in class and some online. My son, all of his classes are online. And so then we were faced with, do we send him to live on campus? And in both cases, we decided to go ahead and let them stay on campus. And so what I think you're finding is that everybody has to remain flexible right now. And everything, it keeps changing. I mean, just this week it changed. And I just think we all have to be open. I know there's a lot of criticism about, should you be paying the same thing if it's online as opposed to in person? And I get that. You know, I'm a very frugal person, but I think we also have to remember that these schools, now let's just set aside the whole conversation about whether they should have been cutting costs long before that, but they still have people on the payroll that they have to pay. And unless they're going to be renegotiating all those salaries, whether it's online or in person, they still have that personnel cost. They still have the building costs. And so I know some people are saying, well, that's just not my issue. I think right now, all of us have to be flexible and understand that this is an extraordinary time. And so we've got some tuition rebates for both our kids. We've got some housing rebates. And in fact, my youngest, after Thanksgiving, they're going to send them home, but she won't go back. So that'll be some cost savings. So we've just been looking at our budget, and we decided what we can afford and what we couldn't, and we move forward based on that.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much for sharing. We had one registrant ask, what are the potential long-term ramifications for universities if on-campus education becomes optional? Do we think costs could go down? What do you think about that?
I think they should. I think at that point, when we're looking past the crisis, that they do need to look at costs. Certainly, there's something that is lost when you don't have them right there, the ability to talk to the professor right after class, that connection and mentorship. There's a lot of things that get lost on online education. But if you remember, even before the pandemic, there was a huge discussion and debate about how to bring down the cost of college. And one of it was more online courses. And I think that they should do a hybrid, because some students need to be in the classroom. My son has autism. And so for him, some remote learning is pretty hard. he's already feeling a little isolated because of his challenges. And so I would like to see for students like him, who their way they learn is to be right there, that they would have that option. And now like for example, some of his math courses, he can breeze through that online. That's okay. My daughter wants to be a teacher. You can't do that online. She's got to be in the classroom. So I think going forward, now that we know that we have the capability of learning and practicing and Lord knows, I've had more Zoom meetings than I could ever want in my lifetime. But we do know that people can do it now, that it is a viable way to learn and conduct meetings and still connect with people. And I'm hoping that now that we know that we can do that, that will bring down the cost for a lot of families.
Absolutely. So Mark, I'd love to ask you about financial aid for this year. So for families like Michelle's who are sending students to college in the fall, will colleges' plans to offer partly or all remote semesters impact financial aid packages that students have already received from their colleges?
Well, certainly. I mean, the thing you need to realize is that the financial aid forms, like the free application for federal student aid, the FAFSA form, are based on 2-year-old income information. So financial aid for the fall, the 2020-21 academic year, is based on 2018 income information. And the FAFSA that families will start filing on October 1st of this year for 2021-22, the next academic year, will be based on 2019 income information, which is, both of these are pre-pandemic. Now, colleges have a process that's sometimes called a financial aid appeal or special circumstances review or professional judgment review, where they can consider unusual circumstances, special circumstances, anything that changed from the base year, the prior year, to the present, as well as anything that differentiates a family from the typical family. So with more than a third of American workers losing their jobs, and just proportionally, more than 1 million parents of college-age children will have lost their jobs or experience a furlough or pay cut. This is going to double or even triple the number of people appealing for more financial aid. And even before the pandemic, job loss and pay cuts were the top reasons for a financial aid appeal. And it was also the type of financial aid appeal that was most likely to be granted. Other examples that might be relevant to the pandemic is high unreimbursed medical and dental expenses and high dependent care costs, such as for a special needs child or an elderly parent. Those are also pretty common. So the process for appealing for more financial aid is relatively straightforward, though there are a lot of nuances. And first thing you need to do is contact the financial aid office at the college, either by email or telephone, and ask them about their process. Most colleges will do one of two things. Some of them have a form they're going to ask you to fill out that you can download from their website. Most will ask you to write a letter where you summarize the special circumstances that affect your ability to pay. I'd suggest listing one per bullet point and identify how, not just the circumstance, but be specific as to details like dates and amounts. So say how much it affected your ability to pay. Like if you lost your job, what the reduction in income is.
Sure, and specific to you, not just necessarily the COVID pandemic, but I lost my job on such and such date, which meant this specific amount of income less for my family, that kind of specifics.
Absolutely. And the colleges do a holistic review. So if you lost your job, but you're now receiving unemployment benefits that exceed your previous pay, you might not get anything, though they look at the full year. If you got severance pay, they also take that into account. Now with that letter, include photocopies, not originals, of documentation of the special circumstances. And I suggest sending it with some sort of proof of receipt, like delivery confirmation or certified mail return receipt requested, so that you know when it was received. But even so, contact the college about a week after you mail it or email it, and confirm receipt to make sure that it got to the right person. I mean, with people working from home, it's possible that it got routed to the wrong office or they haven't been able to get it yet. Mm-hmm. And ask them if they need any additional information. And then it can take a few days to a few weeks for them to respond to the appeal. And they will then make adjustments to the data elements on the FAFSA. So it's very formulaic, the process. So if you had a reduction in income, they will change the income on your FAFSA, and that will then generate a new expected family contribution, which then yields a new financial need, which then yields a new financial aid package. So the only subjectivity is whether the special circumstance justifies an adjustment to the FAFSA. And if it does, and you will get more aid, it may not be as much as you expect, and it may be more in the form of loans than in the form of grants, especially with college budgets being squeezed these days through everything, like still having to pay their cafeteria staff even if nobody's on campus.
Right.
But and that is definitely going to yield some financial relief. And also mention any new expenses, like you had to buy a computer, get internet access, or if you're special needs and you needed an accommodation like a special desk or something on campus and you had to now buy it for home, let them know so that they can take that into account.
Excellent. Thank
Now,
you
there's
so much.
two types of financial aid that are going to be different in part due to the pandemic. One is student loan interest rates. They hit a record low for undergraduate students as low as 2.75%. So you're going to save some money on the student loans that you get during this next year and possibly the year after. The federal work study jobs may also be affected because the CARES Act waived the requirement for colleges to kick in their own money towards work study. It used to be like a 1-part college money, 3 parts federal money. Now it's just the federal money, which may mean that the number of jobs gets cut or the average award, the total pay gets cut. So you may be working fewer hours. Though they do have the ability to convert the work study jobs into grants or even emergency financial aid. So that may be an important difference.
Great. That's so, so helpful. And I think it brings up another question for a lot of families. And Jean, I'd love to direct this one to you. For folks who are really worried about either affording college this year or are just feeling off balance and unsure if going to college remotely is right for them, do you have advice for students considering taking a gap year or a leave of absence? What are the pros and cons of doing that?
A couple of things. I think, first of all, it's very personal, right? I mean, as Michelle was talking about earlier, we all have to remain flexible, but we have to pay attention to what our college is requiring of us, what the temperament of our student is, what they're studying, what course they're, what progression their courses are taking, and how all of this is going to play together. And so to give sort of a blanket answer to that, I think is really, really difficult. And I do think it comes down to, who is your child? And what are their capabilities? My children are both out of college, but I've got a summer intern in my office, and we were talking about the difference between, she and her brother both attend the same university, actually, in the Midwest. It is one of those places where it'll be a combination of classes online and classes in the classroom. But she said, her brother is studying computer science. For him to do his classes online, it's kind of no big deal. She's a poetry major. And to, not have that kind of interaction with a professor in a small liberal arts class, I mean, her feeling was that if they weren't going to be in person, she wasn't going to go back because she knew she would not get as much out of it personally as far as the quality of her education from this excellent university. And that's how I think we need to be making those decisions. But we also have to pay attention to what the colleges are telling us is okay and is not okay. If you are thinking because classes are remote that you're just going to take classes from your local community college, you've got to take a step and make sure that those credits actually will transfer, because some colleges have said if you are not taking our classes at our rates during this time, they will not transfer. And on the financial aid portion of the question. If you take a period of time away from school, your grace period in terms of repaying those loans may run out, and you may have to start the clock on actually paying. So there are a lot of factors in the soup.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And it also makes me wonder, how do we think about future earnings in this case? Are students worried that if they take a year off, that they're falling behind somehow, or that they're not really in line with their peers? I can imagine some people, worried about that, but is that something people really need to be worrying about at the moment?
I mean, I think that's definitely something. We are such a society of measuring up, right? And our kid, I know from my own kids, because I pushed the idea of a gap year in pre-COVID times, and neither one of them would hear of it because they wanted to be on the same trajectory as their friends and as their peers. They didn't want to fall behind. I think the time that we need to be looking at, I think this is a time where we need to be looking at the value in education more than ever before. And that means taking into consideration how much a college wants to have us, how much we'll get in grants rather than in loans, whether 2 years at a community college makes significantly more sense before you transfer those credits to a 4-year school, because you basically cut the college cost in half, and coming into an uncertain job market, much like 2008, depending on how long this COVID recession is with us, is a big unknown. Now, for people who are already in school, that is, it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate timing. But I do think that the question of value has never been more important or more in the headlines.
That makes a lot of sense. And Michelle, for you, how should a student think about a valuable education to them? How does someone assess what a college's value actually is? As we're in this point of late summer, people are making decisions day by day about whether to go back, where to go, whether to switch to a community college. What actually is the value of a college education, and how do we determine that individually? Oh, Michelle, you're muted.
Michelle, you're on mute.
You're on mute at the moment. Oh, Michelle, still muted.
Oh, there we go. Sorry. I didn't want any background noise, but I'll keep it open my best computer crashed over the weekend. So this is my backup, which is 10 years old. So
your life, we're all there with you.
I know, right? So I have been addressing this question with parents for a very long time, particularly because so many people have been borrowing to go to school. And I'm sort of the belief that you got to look at college as a way to get a job. And I know some people are like, oh, no, you have to look at it as enriching, But the fact of the matter is there are a lot of families that can't afford a pricey university or a lot of money to enrich themselves. I have arguments with parents about, having the kids stay on campus. Oh, how can they miss that, experience? Because you don't have the money for it. And right now, we now see that they can get their education and be at home and learn. The ideal situation, of course, let them go stay on campus and have all that, walking around the campus and all that. But if you don't have the money for it, that's not something that you can afford to do. And so in some respects, if you want to look for the silver lining in any of this devastating thing that's happened, is that I think many families are saying, you know what? They don't have to be on campus. Now, obviously they're going to have a different experience, but at the end of the day, for me and my family and my children, it was all about, let's get this education so you can get a job. We look at the studies and we know that college education, if you have a college education or higher education, you get paid more, over a lifetime as opposed to just having a high school education. But the college path is not the only path. there are a lot of careers where you don't have to have a traditional 4-year college education. And I think more people are looking at that right now. But we've always, in my house, it's like, this is about getting a job. And when we looked at their internships, there were not you had to get an internship in the area that you wanted to get a career in. I mean, I'm like a drill sergeant with my children. Of course, that's why I save for my own retirement, because they sure enough gonna put me in a nursing home if I don't have my own money. But we saw this as a path, and it's particularly true for African Americans who often have debt and then no degree because they just don't have enough money to pay. And so look at the bottom line. I saw in the Q&A, there was a question from a high school counselor, and I love this question because she was like, I think she worked at a private school, and middle and upper income families don't ever want to talk about the true cost of college. And it comes time to go to college, and they're shocked, just shocked that their bright little kid isn't getting a full ride or getting all this money. And I love, Mark and I have talked about this for a good decade, right, Mark? That, hope is not a plan. And as smart and bright as you think your kid is, the likelihood of getting a full ride is just not there. And oh yeah, all those soccer games and those hockeys and the ice skating and the cheerleading that you've been dragging those poor kids to all their lives and sitting there all day, they're not going to get a whole bunch of money with that as well. So plan for it. And now, hopefully, lots of families saying, okay, I really do need to look at this cost and see what I can save to make sure my kid can go to college and not come out with a ton of debt.
Yeah. Can I pile on to that for 1 second, Brianna? I think two things that are so crucial. The first, Michelle, and we've all been having these conversations with Mark, because when we have these columns that we write, we pick up the phone and we call Mark because he's the brain. Our kids need to understand how much in real terms they are borrowing, right? And not in the big dollars. They need to understand if they are borrowing $30,000, how much money do they have to earn when they graduate in order to make their monthly payments and move out of the house? Like that has to be really real to them. And if they're not going to be able to do that based on their career, then they either need to borrow less or live home or move in with Michelle, because she takes in many recent college grads. But the other thing, and Mark, this was so new to me and so helpful. The last time we talked, you gave me some benchmarks for how much parents should be saving. And this was the first time I had heard these benchmarks. So can you give them? Because I mean, nothing else has been as illuminating for me in the last couple of years as far as answering the question when parents ask, how much do I have to save?
Well, if your child is going to go to an in-state public college, multiply their age by $3,000, and that's how much you should have saved by now. And for a child that's a newborn this year, you need to save $250 a month from birth. Now that assumes that you're saving 1/3 of the future college costs. It's like any major expense, you're going to spread it out over time. 1/3 from past income, which is savings, 1/3 from current income and financial aid, and 1/3 from future income in the form of loans. But you also need to be careful not to borrow too much. Your total student loan debt at graduation needs to be less than your annual starting salary. The total debt's less than annual income, you can afford to repay it in 10 years or less, which is a relatively reasonable amount of time.
Absolutely. And that figure actually works. And I mean, that's about what my husband and I save for each of our 3 children by the time newborn, little tykes, until they went to college. It was in that $200, $250 range for like 18 years. And we had all the money we needed to send them to college, state college, with no loans. They don't have any loans and we don't have any loans. In fact, we had actually, because they did get some scholarship money, we are able to pay for grad school as well. But it starts early. And if you're thinking, well, my kid is like 10. So then what Jane is talking about, you've got to look at the college experience a little differently. There's nothing wrong with going to community college for the first 2 years, get those courses out of the way. But again, to Jane's point, make sure that they are transferable. With many of the colleges have backed off on that. I mean, it used to be, it was pretty easy to do it. And now, you know, you got to make sure it's absolutely, and many of the community colleges are really smart about this. You'll go in, you'll sit down, they'll look at the colleges that you may want to transfer and make sure the courses match up. And then finish up the 2 years. If you can stay at home, stay at home if you don't have the money. I'm like a no borrow at all. I mean, and I know I'm extreme. I'm like no borrow dollars at all, zero. And you can talk to Mark and Jean about how to do it if you want to borrow, but don't ask me because I'm going to tell you not to borrow. Because I feel like if you start there, then you will borrow. If you decide that you have to borrow, you'll borrow less. And you'll look at the colleges differently, and then just manage the expectations of your students. We talk to all of our kids, okay, so this is what we're saving. You cannot borrow $1 of debt. So pick your colleges wisely. You can apply to whatever college you want, but you got to get enough free money to match what we save to go. And that's that. We weren't giving no 18-year-old no decision about where they're gonna go. What do they know? Nothing.
Very true. And also, I think that's an important message for parents, that they should be having these conversations with their kids and not feeling like, I mean, a lot of parents feel like it's their responsibility to pay for their child's education. And like, that's what they believe and they want to help. And then they're going to take on more debt than they can handle in order to do it. But I think a lot of kids, myself included, when I was 18, if I knew how much my parents were borrowing, I would be horrified. I would say, no, I don't want you to do that. But you have to have the conversation.
Now, I actually do think that it's the parents' responsibility to pay. And here's the principal reason why. I don't know about any of the kids of any people watching or Jane's or Mark's kids. My kids didn't have a job when they were 2 years old. They didn't have a job when they were 5 years old. They didn't have a job when they were 10 years old. So then how would they be able to pay for college except to borrow the money? And so because of that, that's the principal reason we said, we're going to do this. Let's take this on. They didn't choose to be born. We choose to have, you know, my honey's kind of fine. So, you know, we had some kids. And so we said, this is our job because they don't have a job when they're little people. Now, some people say, oh, well, if they don't have some skin in the game, then they're not going to appreciate it. And that's just baloney to me, because I want a full scholarship to college. And I certainly appreciated my college education, even though somebody else was paying for it. And the way, as parents, you make sure is that you hold them accountable just like any scholarship would. They had to keep a certain GPA. We required them to have internships every summer. And we work with them and the Career Center at their colleges to make sure that happened. So we were walking along the way because our money was on the line. And if you can't do it because you just don't make enough, that's okay. Then you talk to your student and you figure out another way for them to go to college. And maybe it is a gap year. Maybe they work for a year, they save all of their salary, which will help them with that first year or two. And that's how you do it, I think, going forward, so that you don't have this bucket load of debt.
Right, that's so helpful. And it does bring up, going back to the pandemic that we are currently living in, this situation in which people who are maybe had plans, you know, they had a 529, they had savings, and now it's actually not there in the way that they expected, right? So we had a registrant write in and say, my child's 529 took a significant hit and she's a senior this year, help. So let's help her or him. Mark, what do you think? What should someone in this situation do if their child is about to go to school in a month?
Well, with the 529 plans, a lot of them have recovered since the drop in from February to March, and the S&P 500 is fully recovered. So if you wait a little bit, you might be fine by the time you have to pay the bills. Worst case scenario, you can now use a 529 plan to repay up to $10,000 of student loans for that beneficiary. It's a lifetime limit per beneficiary, but you could always borrow the money for the fall, and then after the stock market fully recovers and your 529 plan is where you feel more comfortable taking the distribution. You take the distribution to pay off the student loan debt. Or you scrounge money from other sources, like can you defer maintenance on your home, or you don't not using your car now to go to work, so you're not spending as much on gas and oil. Maybe you can find the money somewhere in your budget to squeak by for one semester, and then and take care of it in the next semester.
Right. That's really helpful. Any other suggestions, Jean?
No, I mean, I think that's absolutely the right advice. The only other thing that I would say is make sure if you haven't been paying attention to the investments in your 529, make sure you know that you have been adjusting to take less risk as your kids have gotten older. And if you've got young kids, you want to pay attention to those age brackets. I mean, I remember making a shift in my kids' 529 with each break in school. So I went more conservative after elementary school, more conservative again after middle school, and was, you know, basically not taking much risk at all by the time they entered college.
Yeah, and if you can't do that, you know, Jane is brilliant. So just do an age-based portfolio. That's what we did. We did an age-based for each one. So as they got closer to the time they went to college, it got more conservative. So right now, we didn't have much, you know, maybe a teeny bit of losses. So they have a little bit of money in growth, but no big hit at all, because they moved it to the point, as Jane said, what she did manually, but the managers of the age base do that so that you are not, you know, at risk of a whole bunch of losses right when your kid is about to go to college.
Yeah, it's like a target date fund for 529s.
Right.
A couple people are asking about these the Mark's formulas again, and when you told them to me the first time, you expanded on them for people who wanted their kids or thought that their kids would be going to either out of state public universities or private universities. So it was 3,000 a year per year of age if you thought you'd be going to an in-state public school, 5,000 per year of age if you thought you would be going to an out-of-state public school, and 7,000 per year of age if you thought you would be going to a private college, right?
That's right. And if you're saving for a newborn this year, it's $250 a month for an in-state public college, $450 a month for an out-of-state public college, and $550 a month for a private four-year college. And that assumes that 17 years. In my case, I started saving before my kids were born.
Yeah, goals. These are goals, definitely. I mean, I think when we think about, those are big numbers for people, I think too, like $500 a month for college many, many years in the future. What is your advice for balancing that with other, I mean, especially right now with a lot of tension in people's budgets at the moment? How do we get close to that number? How do we make sure that we're covering other things that we need to cover, but also save for college?
Well, a couple of things. One, your greatest asset is time. If you start saving from birth, about a third of your college savings goal will come from the earnings. If you wait until the child enters high school, it's less than 10%. And to reach the same college savings goal, you'll have to save at least 6 times as much per month. So it's important to get started. Now, you don't have to save the full amount. And you can get started with an automatic investment plan as little as $25 a month. A few will do it for even $15 a month. And once you get started and you make the saving automatic, it becomes easier to adjust the amount you save. So if your child no longer needs diapers or daycare, take the money you were spending on that and redirect it into the college savings plan. If you get a raise, do the same thing. But and important is to make sure it's automatic. I mean, all the 529 plans will set up automatic transfers to your bank account so that you don't have to think to save. And you'll quickly get used to not having that money in your checking account, and makes it easier to adjust.
Excellent.
And tell everybody that you opened one, right? I mean, tell the entire family that this account is there. Because whenever they ask you, what does your kid want for their birthday, and you don't know, or they have everything already, which most, many of them do, tell them to make a contribution, because it'll just grow.
Or if you do get the gifts from them because they aren't willing to give money because they think it's awkward, well, take that gift and sell it on eBay or Craigslist and then use that money to make a contribution. Most of the 529 plans have gifting links that make it easy. So you send out an email message with a special link so that they can contribute directly to your plan. There's also these gift cards that you can buy. I think like one is Gift of College, where you go into a grocery store, you buy a $25 gift card, you send it to them, and they can deposit it into the 529 plan account.
Great. So I'd love to transition now to talking about people who have student loans already. So those who are now paying off their student loans during this pandemic. What relief options, Jean, we could go to you, what relief options are available right now for people paying off their student loans?
So if you've got federal loans, federally backed student loans, the interest rate has gone to 0 and payments are paused until the end of September. And what that means is that if you make a payment, it's all going to principal. So it's making a little bit more headway in terms of eliminating your debt. The other thing that's happening in terms of relief is that if you're on the clock for loan forgiveness, these months of missed payments are counting towards your clock. So you're not losing anything there. We're not sure, though, what's going to happen after September 30th. The Democrats would like to extend this relief through the end of 2021. The Republicans it's not in the new bill. It's not in the HEALS Act. There are a couple of people who've said who've put on the table the idea that if a borrower is out of work with a federally backed loan, they would not have to make payments. And if they have work, they would be eligible for their payments to be maxed at 10% of discretionary income, which is basically what you can get under an income-based repayment program anyway. So I think the bottom line is we're waiting to see what comes from any additional relief that is granted.
Right, and I think I saw President Trump said during a sort of reporter back and forth that he was looking at extending the loan deferment period, but we don't know. What you're saying right now is there's no way to know exactly what's going to happen past September 30th.
Right. And if Congress doesn't do anything, you still have options with federal loans. Federal loans have an economic hardship deferment and an unemployment deferment, and they also have forbearances. Each of these is up to 3 years in total duration. And the income-driven repayment plans, if your monthly income is less than 150% of the poverty line, your monthly payment is 0. So that's also an option. And private student loans, they have forbearances and partial forbearances. And they have a special COVID-19 forbearance, which pauses your payments for 90 days. Unfortunately, interest continues to accrue and will be added to the loan balance if you don't pay that interest as it accrues, but at least it provides some financial relief. So the most important thing is talk to the loan servicer or the lender, ask them what the options are, explain your situation, and see what they offer you. And maybe check out their website first to see what their standard programs are. But if you talk to them, they have a lot of flexibility to make accommodations.
Excellent. And there's been a lot of talk about student loan forgiveness in these bills. Michelle, speculative, of course, but do you think there's a chance that student loan forgiveness will be included in some of this relief? Should it be? What's your perspective?
I think there's a chance at all. No, they don't even want to extend the unemployment benefits. So they definitely, no, not at all. There's no sympathy whatsoever. So I don't think, I've heard people ask me that. I don't think you should count on that. And it's hard to say this because, a lot of the questions are like, help, what do I do with these loans? And there's sort of a principle behind that. Listen, you did borrow the money. And unless, for me, there's some public loan forgiveness programs and some other loan forgiveness programs. And I love those programs because it says, if you take this type of job and we recognize that you could probably make more if you did something else, or you're going to work in a community where a lot of other people do not want to work, we're going to give you this break. I'm all for that. Praise the Lord. But other times people are asking that question because they're trying to figure out some sort of way to not pay it back. And the fact of the matter is, you did take out those loans, you did get an education for it, although some people ended up having to drop out. And so rather than say, how can I get rid of the debt? I think the question is, what is the most manageable way for me to try to pay it back? That's really the question you should be asking. Right now, if you've lost your job or your income has dropped, definitely take advantage of the opportunity to pause payments. And even though the interest rate is going to be increased, because your main focus right now is to keep a roof over your head and food on the table. And you shouldn't feel bad about not being able to pay this right now, because this thing happened to you and you did nothing to cause this pandemic. And so for this period right now, take all that's available. Yes, it's going to make your loan grow, but right now we're talking about emergency times. Now, once we get out of that, or if you haven't lost your job, then I think that you need to put your head down, look at your budget, figure out where you can cut and pay that loan back. Because when those loans are not paid back, that is a debt that we all pay. Which goes back to the whole decision of getting in debt in the first place. So I guess I'm a little bit tougher on that, because you need to be smart about this. This is not new information. Gene has been writing about this forever. Mark has been writing about it. I've been writing about it. It's not like you don't know. And I love that note from that counselor at the private school, because you want to put your head in the sand and believe somehow your kid is going to go to school for free, and that's just not going to happen. And I guess I may sound a little tough, because I think we need to have that tough conversation with people. You just can't live above your means, which is what you're going to be doing if you borrow a lot of money, and expect somebody else to pay that bill.
Absolutely. And we also know that, of course, the other impact on the individual who doesn't pay off the loans is on their credit, which affects your life in so many ways. If you default on a loan, it really does have a major impact. So for all those reasons, and of course their individual impact, it's something to really not take lightly.
Well, and they can garnish your wages. So it's not just that your credit's going to be ruined. They will come after the money and they will get it.
Yeah, and tax refunds.
And if I could just add this, because this is a big question for minorities. You know, we are so behind on so many areas. Not, racism and discrimination is real. And so there's a lot of push for our kids to go to college. Absolutely, totally. So there's really two tracks we should be talking about. The policy, there needs to be more scholarship and grants. That just needs to be. So when we're having these discussions right now with the pandemic, we need to be pushing that forward as well, because there's some families who just can't afford it, and then they feel like they have to take out a loans. So I'm not by any means saying that we should not go to college. So when I'm talking to parents, I say, listen, I'm working and we are writing about this stuff on a policy way so that we can get more money. But until there's more money on the table, this is how your child has to go to school. Realistically, they are not going to be able to go to that private school and stay on campus and have that walking across the campus and laying on a blanket. It's just not going to happen, because you don't have the money. And so let's look at how you can go to send your kid to school so that you can advance. That's, again, community college, staying at home and living with your parents if that's an option. I know some families it may not be, but if it is, make it comfortable for them to be able to do that. And I think we need to change the discussion about if you do feel like you have to take on debt, change the discussion about whether or not they need to be, leave when they graduate. I'm a huge advocate for people going back home to live, again, if it's a situation that they can, until they can get out of this debt completely. Mm-hmm. And that's a way to change the dynamics until we get a policy in which people can afford to go to college without a boatload of debt.
Absolutely. And we did have a registrant write in and say, what do you think the long-term impact of this time will be on financial aid policies? And maybe what you're saying and what we can all hope is going to happen is that it'll either affect the pricing structure of schools or potentially grant aid that's available, or maybe both in a perfect world. But we're coming up to about 15 minutes before we have to wrap up. So I would love to go around and hear from each of you. What is one thing that you want participants of this webinar to take from the experience about paying for college during a pandemic? What's one thing that you would like to tell everybody? Mark, do you want to start?
Sure. Be vocal. I mean, tell your lender, tell the school about anything that's affecting your ability to pay for college, repay your student loans, because if you don't tell them, they can't make any accommodations. And the more you tell them, the more pressure there'll be on the colleges to make accommodations, because the colleges are worried about having students not showing up in the fall. And they may be taking a gap year or a leave of absence, and there are some estimates that suggest that 10 to 20% enrollment declines in the fall, which means 10 to 20% less tuition revenue for the college. That puts them under a lot of financial pressure. And so if you let them know what problems you're facing, they'll do more to try to make sure that you are able to show up in the fall.
Very, very helpful. Yeah. And Jean, what would you say?
I first of all, I agree with Mark, and we have not talked about the fact that there was in the CARES Act billions of dollars in additional money for these college students who did not get the $500 per dependent in many cases. You've got to have filed the FAFSA to get at that money, and it is being flowed through your financial aid office. So if you've experienced COVID-related expenses, travel, transportation, that desk that Mark was talking about, or the chair, you should go back to your school and you should be asking for some of that as well. But the other thing that I would say is I do just think we have to be talking about this much, much earlier with our kids, and be really honest about what college costs and about what is reasonable for our families. Because if we're not honest with them, then their expectations get out of whack. And that's, I think, where a lot of families get into trouble, because it's where parents believe that they'll just borrow at any cost. And then they put themselves behind on retirement, and the whole thing can collapse.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Michelle.
I'm just going to piggyback on what Jean said. One of the questions you asked her at the beginning, she said, think about your individual child and your situation, because we have a sort of dreamy ideal about college and the experience. And that often drives the decisions about college. And we just can't do that. You just can't do that. And high school counselors, beat their heads on the wall trying to tell parents this. I beat my head on it trying to tell them, you just need to think realistically, what is doable for my family? What is doable for my child? And start there. I use this phrase, manage expectation, which was Jean just talked about. So my kids have known about this since they could ask for anything. Can I go to McDonald's? Well, let's talk about your college. And so they knew about their 529 plan. They knew why we said no to things so that we could prepare. But we also said, listen, if we don't have enough, let's have this conversation about what college is going to look like. And I know we don't have a little time, but just, I love telling stories. So my youngest wants to be a teacher. And again, remember I told you, I said they could go apply to any school they wanted. So she wanted to go to Florida, mostly because she wants to get away from me. And if you've been here with me for the last 45 minutes, you can understand why.
No.
No, I'm realistic about that. So she's like, I want to get as far away from this crazy woman as I possibly can. So I said, sure, you could apply to a school in Florida to be a teacher, where we have great teaching colleges in Maryland. Go right ahead, honey. But you know the rule, you got to get enough money. And so she started the application process, and then she came back to me and she said, you know what? It makes no sense really for me to try to go through all of this to go to Florida when we've got good schools here. And that she didn't just make that up. That's because, years before I was sort of drilling this, both my husband and I drilling this into her. She came to that decision herself, but had she not, she still wouldn't have been in Florida. And one person asked me, well, what if your kid gets into Harvard? Because my kids are really smart, and they probably could have. And I said, well, if we don't have Harvard, because Harvard's not going to give us any money. We're way above the threshold in which they give free money. And I said, then my kid's not going to Harvard. How could you not send your kid to Harvard? And I said, well, because we don't have the money for it. And my kid's going to be a good teacher, whether she goes to Towson University, which is a great school, or Harvard. And I've said this a million times, and I'll say it again. I work at the Washington Post. I went to city schools in Baltimore and the State College, and I ended up at the Washington Post. And the guy sitting across from me, a dear friend of mine, he did go to Harvard, but we both ended up at the Washington Post. It's about how you drive your kids and how driven your children are. And so the college does not matter as much as how they perform in whatever school that they go to. And all of us are sort of thinking it has to be a certain kind of school. That is a myth that is going to cost you a lot of debt over a lot of decades.
You can get a great quality education at an in-state public college for a quarter to a third the cost of a private college. There's no reason why you need to go to an Ivy League institution to get a great quality education.
And for students who are thinking about this right now related to the pandemic, maybe they've already gotten into a school that they maybe don't want to go to anymore because they've rethought the value question and they'd like to transfer. Is it too late for them to do that? We're at July 31st at the moment. What does the timing look like for someone who's just about to start school and thinking about this right now?
Community colleges have rolling admissions. I mean, they have rolling admissions. And I also think that because of what Mark said and enrollments expecting to be down, I would be really surprised if some schools were not just evaluating candidates and taking them. I could be wrong on that, but I kind of think if you want to come, they may be willing to take you.
Hundreds of colleges still have space available. Just contact the college, ask them whether you can get in, and they're more than happy to take your money.
And if you haven't signed a contract to obligate you to some tuition, you know, got a master's in business, something called about sunken costs. Sort of, you know, we talk about that. So don't just go because you feel you have to. You know, if you can't afford it, you should let the school know and say, I just can't come. And even if that means you lose a deposit or something to that extent, then lose the deposit and then just transfer to the university. Maybe you can do it for the fall, but you can do it for the spring. Don't just go because you feel you have to because some money is on the line. If it's not a significant amount, then yeah, go ahead and back out because it'll cost you way more in the end if you try to still forge ahead when you just can't afford it.
Right. And I get this question from readers quite often. There's some confusion around if you've already received financial aid at one college, does your financial aid transfer to another college? If you've already accepted student loans, so everyone's shaking their heads. Mark, what's your answer to that?
Financial aid is specific to the college, and there is federal student aid, but the amounts that you get at the college may differ. So you have to add that college to your FAFSA. That college will then give you a new financial aid package. So there's no direct transfer. If you've already used some of that financial aid, let's say you transfer after the first semester, your loan eligibility will be reduced by the amounts of the loans you've already received.
Okay, so that's something to think about for students who do end up going to the school that they planned this fall and then transfer in the spring, which I'm imagining is going to be a relatively potentially common experience. Say a student isn't really up for remote learning or decides that it's not for them, or the school that they chose is not really working for them. So maybe we can talk a little bit more just in this last couple of minutes about transferring. Any advice that we have for students who might be going through that process?
Well, one thing is if you take a gap year, say for your first semester, and you decide to take community college classes during that gap year, your four-year college may then consider you to be a transfer student as opposed to a first-year student. And the financial aid for transfer students on average is about $2,500 less grants. So you may be hurting the affordability of that four-year college if you do that. Some of them have said they're not going to consider it to be a transfer, but most of them still will.
That makes sense. So maybe there's something to be considered with if you don't want to take community colleges or community college classes, but you do want to take a little bit of a break. Could you take an online course that's sort of a private, UX design course or something to enrich yourself, but that isn't necessarily a for-credit course? Is that an option?
I had a question from a mother whose son had a scholarship and he didn't like the idea of taking online courses, and so they were in a battle. And it wasn't the fact that he couldn't do it; he just didn't want to. You're the parent. Make them put on their big pants. This is what happens as you become an adult. You got to make hard decisions. If you can, and it's not an issue of your learning ability, take the online class. You should encourage your children to do it, especially if there's a scholarship online. And if they don't, then they have to have natural consequences of that decision. So if they, don't want to take the online courses because they just don't want to, and they lose the scholarship, well, then they've got to figure out how to make up the difference. And in that case, I don't think the parents should be on the line because you told them what to do. They don't want to listen because they think they're grown. Then at that point, they have to figure out how to pay for school, at least for the amount of scholarship that they lost. And you just say it like that. You don't have to, because they are 18, at certain points you can't make them, but you can make them. And my husband, I took a parenting class and the instructor said natural consequences. So baby, if you don't do this, because I know you can do the online courses, you just don't want to, well, then you're going to have to figure out how to pay for it. Be the parent.
Parents need to learn how to say no to their children.
That's right.
Yeah, it sounds like a theme of the conversation has been communicating with your financial aid office, with your children, with, just sort of making it clear what expectations are, what consequences are, what sort of money you have and don't have in order to pay for college. And I think that's a really good takeaway.
Yeah, I mean, listen, all of us are doing this, would we rather be in the room together? I'd love to be there with Jean and Mark and, hug each other and talk, but I've got to do all these Zoom calls. I don't want to do that either. So this is a time, this pandemic has forced all of us to be able to adapt, and that includes your young adult child. And you just try to make the situation as amenable to them as possible. Like I told you about my son, he's autistic. So we have things in place to make sure he concentrates. We have a way to stay on top of him. And, he and I talked about having a schedule, he's more visual. So instead of having everything on his phone, let's write out your schedule. It's not ideal, but this is what's happening right now. And this is a life lesson, a lifelong lesson. All of us who've had jobs for a long time know that you have to adapt to a new boss, a new situation all the time. And unfortunately, perhaps our children are introduced to this concept a lot sooner than any of us would like. Sure, we'd love them to go out. And personally, I want them to go to campus because they are getting on my last nerve. I am sick of them not turning my lights out, right? But we tell this is what we have to do for right now to get through this pandemic. And that's what you need to do as a parent, to tell them this is what you have to do. And if you don't want to do this, then you're going to have to figure out how to manage this if you lose your scholarship money.
Exactly. So much valuable information here today. Thank you all so much for sharing your expertise on so many topics, even beyond paying for college. I feel like I learned a lot. And we got a lot of questions from from participants, many of which we didn't get to. And I know that they'd love to keep up with you and hear more of what you have to say. So where can people watching right now learn more from you? Jean, where can they find you after this webinar ends?
At hermoney.com. And I know there's some questions that we didn't get to. My podcast, Her Money, we do regular mailbag episodes. So just send us letters and questions and we will happily funnel them and they'll end up on a podcast.
Wonderful. That sounds great. And Mark, how about you?
Well, at savingforcollege.com. And we have also a student loan section, savingforcollege.com/student-loans. And I also write a column for Forbes.com. So I'll take a look at the questions that were submitted and see if any of them are a good topic for a column.
Perfect. And Michelle, where can they find you?
Yeah, same thing. You can go to WashingtonPost.com. I have a weekly chat on Thursdays from noon to 1, every Thursday, noon to 1. So you can come over to that chat and put your question in, and hopefully you guys will send us the questions, and I can do the same thing, write a column answering some of the questions. I suspect some people won't want me to. I'm a little tough. So, but I say it with love and just a lot of experience having deal with people who are trying to dig out of all this debt. So just know that I want your kid to have what you want your kid to have, but sometimes that can't happen. And let me be the bad guy. I'll talk to your kid.
A lot of parents would appreciate that. Valuable perspective for sure. And so thank you everyone for watching today. Again, my name is Brianna McGurn. I'm the student loans analyst at Forbes Advisor. And to keep the conversation going, you can follow us, Forbes Advisor, on Facebook, on Twitter at Forbes Advisor. You can see the advice we share on college savings topics, but everything money, credit cards, investing, insurance, loans, all of it. And so thank you again for to our panelists for being here today. And I wish you all a great rest of your Friday.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.